Croeso friends, before we get into anything else, let me take a moment to formally thank everyone who helped me reach 250 followers and let me go forward with my very first giveaway. And congratulations to Margot Marshall, the winner and hopefully proud new owner of One Smocked Apron. My next giveaway will be when I reach 500 subscribers, and considering how quickly we've gone from 250 to the current count of 295, 5 days, it may be sooner than I expected. Thank you all again. Today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm not going to be making anything specific. It's going to be more of a tutorial or how-to video. One of the things I'm pretty frequently asked is how I set gores in fabric. Gores are triangular shaped pieces of fabric designed to add width to the circumference of a garment without adding additional bulk in other places. They can be set into seams like the side seams of shifts, tunics, and dresses of rectangular construction. However, they can also be set into the middle of a larger piece of fabric, as in the London hood I recently made or the front and back of early medieval dresses. And it's those latter kinds that most people have the biggest problems with. They are a bit fussy, and hopefully we will demystify some of that today. So everyone grab your cuppa, which for me today happens to be Upton Vanilla with cream, and let's get into it. To begin, here's an example of the kind of gore we're going to be exploring today. Not the kind set into an existing seam, but the kind set into a cut in the middle of a piece of fabric. In this case, into the side of a London hood to create fullness over the shoulders. This hood was 100% hand sewn, but even if I'm sewing the foundational seams on my machine, I prefer to sew at least the point of the inset gores by hand. I find it gives me more control that way. My process consists of 3 steps: sewing the gore, felling the seam allowances, and reinforcing the point. Let's gather our materials, shall we? For today's tutorial, I will need 1 gore piece, here shown in a kind of mustard yellow, 1 fashion or body piece, representing the garment that the gore will be inserted to, here shown in white for contrast, 1 spool of red thread to create the most visual contrast possible. I'm just using a polyester hand quilting thread, 1 thimble, 1 pair of scissors, 1 pin cushion and needle book, and 2 washable markers. And now we're ready to get started. First, I will start off by marking the stitching lines on the gore just to show where I will be sewing. In this tutorial, I'm just using some washable name brand markers, but when I mark my sewing lines on actual garments, I tend to either use a pencil, don't mark on the right side of your fabric, pencil doesn't always wash out well, or a pen with heat-sensitive ink, like the Friction brand pens, which I adore. Disclaimer, they can reappear in freezing temperatures according to my friend Violet, who used to live in Alaska, but that's less of a problem for me here in Texas. You have been warned. Next, I will use the gore markings to draw the length of the cut I will make in the body fabric. Notice that I am only marking the length of the gore to the end of that sewing line. Because we will not be sewing the entire length of the gore side, stopping at the seam allowance marking will ensure that I don't have extra length on the sides of the cut. Trust me, I've made that mistake too many times. Once the cutting line is marked, we will add the seam allowance or sewing lines to the body fabric. The seam allowance will be the same width as the gore seam allowance until the top 1.5 or 2 inches or so, when they will taper into a point just above where the cutting line ends. Ideally, you want there to be only a few threads worth of seam allowance at the very top of the gore. This is what ensures a sharp point instead of an awkward puckered or rounded gore top. Now it's time to thread up our needle. Ideally for this, you want a short, thin needle that you can control easily, as setting a gore can be kind of fiddly. Now I'll cut the opening for the gore, making sure to cut to the very top but no farther. I'm serious here, a couple of threads can make a huge difference to the finished product. Thimble on, and we're ready to start. Here you can see where I will be lining up the sewing line to sewing line on the separate pieces of fabric.
Let me zoom in so you can see close up. For the purposes of this tutorial, the sides of the fabric that have already been marked will be considered the right sides. So I will begin by placing the gore right side down on the body fabric with the point facing down towards the cut. I promise this will make sense in just a moment. I will start by inserting my needle into the gore fabric from the wrong side, just to the right of where the seam lines cross. I will then catch just a couple of threads at the point of the body fabric seam allowance, and then back up to the left of where the gore seam lines cross. When I draw that thread tight, it will pull those 2 points to meet. This will be the sharp point of our inset gore. I will take a couple of extra tiny stitches to secure these 2 pieces of fabric together before attempting to manipulate the gore down into the slit. Once those stitches have been pulled nice and tight, I can flip the gore down and begin matching up the stitching lines and pinning them into place. Then I will flip the whole piece over because I prefer to stitch from the body side. That way I can more easily control the placement of the stitches with regards to that tapering seam allowance. It's not visible on camera, so even though I can see the stitching line from the wrong side, I'm going to go ahead and trace it so you can see it too. Then I'll bring the thread through to the body side and start stitching along the marked line with a very tight back stitch. This area of the gore is going to take the most stress and is the least structurally sound part. We'll go back and reinforce the very point in a couple of different ways, but the first line of defense is a sturdy line of stitching. I'll continue this back stitch until about an inch or so past where the tapered seam allowance stops. This is the part I do by hand with every inset gore. Once I reach that point, I'll either continue the length of the seam with a running back stitch, as in this tutorial and on most of my London hoods, or I will finish the seam on a sewing machine, as in a shift or dress. If you're interested in learning how to sew inset gores completely by machine, make sure to check out Morgan Donner's fantastic video tutorial on the subject. I'll see if I can put it in the cards up in the top corner, but I will definitely link it in the description below either way.
Very difficult to film right now.
Okay, 15 minutes of pets and scritches later and we're back to stitching. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of the gore that I did with the first side. This process will be slightly more fiddly because I have to manipulate the gore seam allowances to the back of the work and make sure that everything lines up properly. My apologies for the weird autofocus issues. My camera was having a tantrum today, as evidenced by the fact that it took 3.5 tries to film this successfully. I'm tracing the stitching line to the wrong side of the body fabric before pinning this time for visual ease. Then the process is the same as it was before. Match up the lines, pin in place. And since I pinned along the lines this time instead of at right angles, I can give a rough preview of what the finished gore will look like. I'm again starting from the point of the gore and working in a tiny backstitch towards the bottom of the fabric. At this point, it's essential to be very careful with your stitch placement, as the body fabric will have a tendency to bunch up or fold just above the point of the gore. It's easy to end up making stitches too far away from the seam allowance or inadvertently catching folds of the fabric in your stitches. Again, I am working in a small back stitch for sturdiness, extending down that stitching line for an inch or two past where the tapering seam allowance ends, then switching to a running back stitch or machine stitching depending on the scope of the project. Now you can see from the back and the front what the inserted gore looks like, with a nice sharp point. In order to make the next step easier, I'm going to pop over to my ironing board and press the seam allowances flat away from the gore. And we're back, along with more autofocus tantruming. You can see how after pressing, the gore edges are straight and crisp. In order to protect the tapering seam allowances of the body fabric, we will be felling the seam allowances of the gore. I'll start by trimming down the edges of the body seam allowance by about half. Next, starting from the bottom of the seam upward, I will fold the gore seam allowance over the trimmed body seam allowance and pin that down to the body fabric. I left the point of the gore to the very end and then secured the folded point with a single pin facing downwards. This will make manipulating the body fabric around the point of the gore easier when I get to actually felling that part. I'm starting from the bottom of one side of the gore and stitching my way to the top, catching just a thread or two of the body fabric. This results in just a dot of the thread being visible from the right side, and if you use a matching thread, it becomes nearly invisible. As I get closer to the top of the gore, I make felling stitches closer together, and I'm careful to make sure the body fabric is smoothed away from the point. This part can be a little tricky since the body fabric around the point doesn't want to lay quite flat. Once I hit the folded point of the seam allowance, I'll take a couple of stitches in place to secure things, and then proceed down the other side. One of the advantages of felling the seam allowances down is that it encases the raw fabric edges, preventing fraying, finishing the inside of the garment in an aesthetically pleasing manner, and lengthening the lifespan of the finished product. The other is that by felling the seam allowances, it distributes some of the stress from the point of the actual gore to the body fabric around it. Now that we have sewn the gore into place and felled the seam allowances down, it's time to reinforce the point of the gore. Again, this would normally be done with a matching color of thread to make the stitching as invisible as possible. Starting from the back of the fabric, I'm taking tiny stitches around the very point of the gore, taking care to catch both the gore material and the body material with each stitch. This will reinforce and encase the very point of the gore. I generally stitch about 1/4 to 1/2 inch down either side of the point. And we're done. So once again, you can see a comparison between the finished hood with Inset Gore along with our wee tutorial gore made using the same process.
So, there we go. I hope that this little tutorial has been helpful for everyone. If I was unclear or if you have further questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will answer them as best as I can. One other piece of exciting news, CosTube is putting on a virtual costume college event this August. There will be panels and video classes and workshops. For centralized information, please follow the CosTube guide on Instagram, and we'll make sure to put a link in my description below. And if there's anything you'd like to see me teach, let me know in a comment so I can start pulling resources together. Thank you all for joining me today. If you have enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're the kind of person who likes getting notifications when new videos go out, I do try my best to upload those every other Friday. Then click the little bell to turn them on. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and I will put a link to those in the description, as well as my new Ko-fi page, just in case you would like to make a donation to the Alms Purse and keep Opus Elenae in materials. As always, friends, be kind, do the work, continue supporting marginalized people, and keep creating. Hwyl. One other piece of exciting news, CosTube is putting on a virtual costume college. Really? You're not done. And now he's on a piece of paper.